Good morning. Page 265. The archipelago was a world without diplomas, a world in which the only credentials were one's own claims. The Zec was not supposed to have documents with him, including educational records. In arriving at a new camp, you yourself would invent who you make yourself out to be this time. In camp, it was advantageous to be a medical assistant, a barber, an accordion player. I daren't go any higher. My dad used to play the accordion really, really well. He just passed away a couple months ago. I daren't go any higher. You would get along all right if you were a tinsmith, a glass blower, or an automobile mechanic. But woe is on you if you were a geneticist or, God help you, a philosopher, a linguist, an art historian. Then you had it. You would kick the bucket on general work in 2 weeks. More than once I dreamed of declaring myself a medical assistant. How many writers and philologists saved themselves in the archipelago this way? But each time I could not make up my mind to do it, not even because of the superficial examination. Knowing medicine within the limits of a literate layman, yes, and having a smattering of Latin, somehow or other, I would have bluffed my way through. But I found it awful to picture myself giving shots without know-how. If there had been only powders, syrups, poultices, and cupping, I would have tried it. Having learned from my experience at Novi Jerusalem that being a commander of production was repulsive, when I was shifted to my next camp at Kaluga Gates in Moscow itself, right at the threshold at the gatehouse, I lied, saying that I was a norm setter. I had heard that term in camp for the first time in my life, and I had not the faintest idea what norm setting was, but I had hoped it was along mathematical lines. The reason I had to tell my lie right there at the gatehouse on the threshold was that the site chief, Junior Lieutenant Nevizhin, a tall, gloomy hunchback, came to question the new prisoner transport right away. Then and there, at the gatehouse, despite our arrival at night, we had to decide by morning who was to be sent where. He was that businesslike. With a distrustful stare, he seized up my officer's breeches, stuffed into my boots, my long-skirted overcoat, my face lit up with eagerness to serve, and asked me a couple of questions about norm setting. I felt I had replied skillfully, but I realized afterward that my first 2 words had exposed me to Nevizhin. And in the morning, I was not taken out to work. I had been victorious. 2 days passed, and he appointed me, not a norm setter, but much higher, works manager. In other words, I was a senior to the work assigner, chief of all the brigadiers. I had to go out of the frying pan. I had got out of the frying pan and into the fire. There had been no such post before I came there. That showed what a loyal dog I had looked to him to be, and what a one Nevizhin would have made of me too. But once again my career fell through. God saved me. That same week, Nevizhin was removed from his post for stealing building materials. He had a very powerful personality, possessed an almost hypnotic stare, and he did not even have to raise his voice for the whole lineup to listen to him with trepidation. On grounds both of age, he was over 50, and of camp experience, and his own cruelty, he ought long since to have been an NKVD general, and they said that he had in fact already been a lieutenant colonel. However, he could not overcome his passion for stealing. He was never arrested because he was one of their own, but instead was merely removed from duty for a time, and each time reduced in rank. And now he hadn't even been able to hold on to the rank of junior lieutenant either. Lieutenant Mironov, who replaced him, didn't have the patience to train anyone, and I myself could not get it into my head what they wanted was for me to be a crushing hammer. Mironov turned out to be dissatisfied with me in every way, and he was even annoyed with and rejected my energetic reports. Quote, "You don't even know how to write. You have a clumsy style," unquote. And he told me, and he held out to me the report by Pavlov, the foreman. Quote, "Here's a man who knows how to write," unquote. On analyzation of certain facts of reduction of fulfillment of plan, there is 1. Insufficient quantity of construction materials. 2. Because of incomplete supply with tools of the brigade. 3. Upon sufficient organization of work on the side of the technical personnel. 4. And also safety precautions not being observed. The value of this style is that the work management was to shame for everything, and the camp administration for nothing. Incidentally, this Pavlov, a former tank officer who still went around in his helmet, had a similar way of talking. "If you understand about love, then prove to me what's love." Quote. He was discussing a familiar subject. He was unanimously praised by women who had been intimate with him. In camp, this sort of thing is not kept very secret. The second week there, I was demoted in disgrace to general work, and in my place they appointed that same Valia Pavlov. Since I had not contested with him for the place and had not resisted my ouster, he sent me out not with a shovel, but with a painter's brigade. The whole brief history of my leadership did, however, secure me an advantage in living conditions. As works manager, I was housed in special trustees' room, one of 2 privileged rooms in the camp, and Pavlov was already living in the other such room. And when I was dismissed, no worthy claimant turned up for my cot, and for several months I continued to live there. And then, at a time, I valued only the better living conditions in this room. Instead of multiple bunks, there were ordinary cots and 1 bed table for every 2 persons, not for a whole brigade. During the day, the door was locked, and you could leave your things there. Last, there was a half-legal electric hot plate, and it was not necessary to go and crowd around the big common stove in the yard. Slave of my oppressed and frightened body, I valued only this at the time. But now, when I have the urge to write about my neighbors in that room, I realize what its principal advantage was. Never again in my life, either through personal inclination or the social labyrinth, when I could get close to such people as Air Force General Belyayev and the MVD man Zinoviev, who, if not a general, was close to it. I now know that a writer cannot afford to give in to feelings of rage, disgust, or contempt. Did you answer someone in a temper? If so, you didn't hear him out and lost track of his system of opinions. You avoided someone out of disgust, and a completely unknown personality slipped out of your ken. Precisely the type you would have needed someday. But however tardily, I nonetheless caught myself and realized I had always devoted my time and attention to people who fascinated me and were pleasant, who engaged my sympathy, and that as a result, I was seeing the society, like the moon, always from one side. But just as the moon, as it swings slightly back and forth, liberation shows us a portion of its dark side too. So that chamber of monstrosities disclosed people unknown to me. Air Force, oh baby, oh baby. Okay, yeah. Air Force Major General Aleksandr Ivanovich Belyayev. Everyone in camp still called him the General. was invariably noticed by every new arrival on the first day in the first lineup. He stood out from the whole blackish-gray lousy camp column, not only in height and bearing, but because of his excellent leather coat, no doubt foreign made, of a kind you would not see on the street in Moscow. The people who wore them ride about in automobiles, and even more because of his particular air of non-presence. Even without stirring in the camp column, he was able to demonstrate that he had no relationship whatsoever with all that camp rabble swarming about him, that he would even die without realizing how he had come to be there. Stretched to his full height, he looked over heads of the mob, just as if he were reviewing a completely different parade which he could not see, which we could not see. And when the trooping out began and the guard at the gatehouse whacked a board across the backs of the sacks on the outside of the department, Belyayev, in his brigade of work trustees, never tried to be the one on the end. If he did happen to get there, he squeamishly shuddered and bent down as he went past the gatehouse, showing by his whole back how he held the gatehouse sentry in contempt, and the latter did not dare touch him. While I was still works manager, in other words, an important chief, I became acquainted with the general work in the following way. In the construction office where he worked as assistant norm setter, I noticed that he was smoking, and I approached him to get a light from his cigarette. I politely asked his permission and had already bent over his desk in readiness. With a sharp gesture, Belyayev jerked his cigarette from in front of mine, as though fearing I might infect it, got out an expensive chrome-plated lighter, and placed it down before me. It was easier for him to let me soil and spoil his lighter than to lower himself by holding his cigarette for me. I was embarrassed, and whenever anyone was impudent enough to ask him for a light from his cigarette, he always placed his expensive lighter in front of him the same way, thus crushing him completely and dispelling any desire to approach him a second time, as if anyone managed to catch him at a moment, and if anyone managed to catch him at the very moment when he himself was lighting up with his lighter and hastened to shove his cigarette toward him, he calmly blew out the lighter, closed its top, and placed it like that in front of the person approaching. This gave them to understand the whole magnitude of his sacrifice, and if there was no one else from whom to get a light, all the free foremen and prisoner brigadiers who swarmed in the office, went outdoors in the courtyard to get one rather than to him. Housed in the same room with him now, and with our cots, in fact, side by side, I was able to discover that squeamishness, disdain, and irritation were the principal feelings possessing him in his situation as a prisoner. Not only did he never go out to the camp, mess hall, I don't even know where the door to it is, but he wouldn't let our neighbor, Prokhorov, bring him anything from the camp slops except his bread ration. Was there any other sect in the archipelago who could have so mocked his poor bread ration? Belyayev took it gingerly, like a dirty toad, for you see it had been touched by the hands and carried on wooden trays, and trimmed it with his knife on all 6 sides, cutting off both the crust and the dough as well. These 6 cut-off pieces he never gave to those who asked for them, to Prokhorov or the old man orderly, but threw them in the slop bucket. Once I was even so bold as to ask him why he didn't give them to Prokhorov. He proudly threw back his head, his white hair cropped very short. He wore his hair short so that it would seem both a hairstyle and a camp haircut. My cellmate at the Lubyanka once told me, "Please let me finish your soup." I was nearly sick to my stomach. I react very painfully to human humiliation, unquote. He refused bread to the hungry so as not to humiliate them. The general was able to preserve all his haughtiness with such ease because there was a trolley bus number 4 stopped near the gatehouse. Every day at 1 p.m., we returned from a work compound to the residence compound for lunch. The general's wife would descend from a trolley bus at the outer gatehouse, bringing a hot meal in thermoses, cooked just an hour before in the general's kitchen at home. On weekdays, they were not permitted to meet, and the thermoses were handed over by the turnkey. But on Sundays, they spent half an hour together at the gatehouse. They said his wife always left in tears. Alexander Ivanovich took out on her everything that had accumulated in his proud and suffering soul in the course of a week. Belyaev made one accurate observation, quote, "In camp it is impossible to keep things or foodstuffs simply in a box or simply under lock and key. The box has to be a steel box and bolted to the floor. But from this there followed, unquote, but from this there followed the conclusion, quote, out of 100 people in camp, 80 are scoundrels." He didn't say 95, so as not to lose all his listeners. Quote, if I should ever meet anyone from in here out in freedom, and that person should rush up to me, I would say, "You are insane. I've never met you before." "How I suffer from barracks living," he said. "This is only with 6 people there. If I could eat by myself, locked in alone, if only," unquote. When he was hinting that we ought to go outside while he ate, was he hinting we ought to go outside? He especially wanted to eat alone. Was it because what he ate today was incomparable with what others ate, or was it simply out of his own circle's established custom of hiding their bounty from the hungry? On the other hand, he loved to talk with us, and it's highly unlikely that he would really have liked to be in a separate room. Excuse me. But the way he liked to talk was one-sided, loudly, self-confidently, and only about himself. Quote, they offered me another camp, excuse me, with more comfortable conditions, unquote. I can quite well picture that they do offer such as him a choice. Quote, that never happens to me. Do you know, when I was in Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, unquote, but nothing of any interest at all came after that, just some sort of nonsense to provide some sort of justification for that resounding introduction. Quote, when I was in the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, unquote, he had really been around and seen the sights. He was less than 50 and was still good and strong. There was just one strange thing. He was an Air Force Major General, but he never talked about a single battle flight, not even one single flight. And yet, judging by his own account, he was the head of the Air Force purchasing mission in the United States during the war. America had evidently astonished him, and he managed to buy a lot from there too. He never lowered himself to explain to us precisely what he had been arrested for, but evidently it was in connection with his American trip or his stories about it. Quote, Allstep proposed the path of complete confession, but I said I would rather have my term doubled, but I am guilty of nothing, unquote. He can readily believe that, as far as the government was concerned, he was innocent of any guilt. They gave him not a double, but a half term, 5 years, when even a 16-year-old chatterbox has got more time than that. Looking at him and listening to him, I used to think, this is what he is like now. After the rough fingers had torn his shoulder boards off, I can just picture how he cringed. And after the body searches, after the boxes, after the Black Marias, after hands behind your backs, He did not allow himself to be contradicted even in petty things, let alone in big things. Big things he would not even have discussed with us, since we were unworthy, except for Zenobia. But not once did I ever see him absorb any thought he himself had not expressed. He was simply incapable of accepting any argument. He knew everything before we spoke. What had he been like earlier, as the head of the purchasing mission, as Soviet envoy to the West? A polished, white-faced, impenetrable sphinx, a symbol of the new Russia, and they understood it in the West. What would it have been like to approach him with a request, or to shove your head into his office with a request? How he would have barked, how he'd come down on you. I would have to explain a lot if he had come a long way, if he had come from a long line of military men, but he hadn't. These Himalayas of self-assurance had been mastered by a Soviet general of the first generation. During the Civil War, in the Red Army, he was probably a young fellow in bath sandals who couldn't sign his name. How had all this come into being so swiftly? Had he always been in an elite circle, even aboard trains, even at resorts, always with those in his own group, behind the iron gates, where entrance was permitted only with passes? Excuse me. Sorry. And what about the others? More likely to be like him than different? And what would happen if the truth that the sum of the angles of a triangle is equal to 180 degrees were to threaten their private residences, their ranks, their assignments abroad, in case they would cut off your head for drawing a triangle? Triangular pediments would be knocked off all houses. A decree would be issued that angles henceforth were to be measured in radians. And once again I thought, what about me? Why couldn't they have made the same sort of general out of me in the course of 20 years? Of course they could have. And once again I looked closely. Alexander Ivanovich was not at all a bad chap. When he read Gogol, he laughed warmly, and he used to make us all laugh when he was in a good mood. He had an intelligent laugh. If I had wanted to nourish hatred for him in myself, there, when we were lying next to one another on our cots, I could have done it. The way was not closed for him to become a fully good person, but only through suffering. Alright, let me stop there. Thank you for listening. Hope you have a good day.